Richard Hale had always imagined death as silence. Not light, not darkness, just an abrupt stop, like a gavel hitting wood and ending the session. But when the pain struck his chest that night in his office, sharp, searing, relentless, he barely had time to mutter a curse before his head slammed against the polished mahogany desk. The files he had been reviewing scattered, fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. A coffee cup tipped, staining the final motion he had prepared for his most recent case. For one breathless second, Richard thought it was just another panic attack, the kind that came from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. But the numbness spreading down his left arm told him otherwise. He gasped for air. His vision darkened. And then nothing. No hospital. No paramedics. No mourners rushing to his side. Instead, Richard found himself standing upright. The room was gone. The familiar clutter of his office, his shelves of legal books, his trophies, his expensive leather chair, had melted away. He was in a place he had never seen before. At first, he thought it was a courtroom. The shape was unmistakable, benches arranged in rows, a raised platform for the judge, long wooden tables where lawyers usually sat. But this was no human court. The walls stretched impossibly high, carved from marble that shimmered faintly, as though light itself was trapped within. The ceiling dissolved into a haze of gray and gold, shifting like storm clouds. And the silence. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of attention, as if hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, waiting. Richard swallowed, tugging at the knot of his tie. His suit was immaculate, black, pressed, gleaming as if freshly tailored. Even his cufflinks glowed faintly, though he hadn't worn cufflinks in years. He turned. The benches were full, but not with people. Rows of figures sat in utter stillness. Some appeared human, others were mere outlines, forms without faces, shadows without substance. Yet all were watching him, their collective gaze pressed on his chest like a weight heavier than any heart attack. Richard's instincts told him to look toward the raised bench at the far end. That's where the judge should be. And there, seated behind the massive platform, was no man or woman. It was a presence, vast, radiant, terrifying in its stillness. Richard couldn't say if it had a face. At times, he thought he saw eyes burning like suns. At others, it was nothing but shifting light. Yet the authority that radiated from it was unmistakable. When it spoke, the sound wasn't a sound at all. It was a weight in the bones, a vibration in the marrow of existence itself. "Richard Hale," it said, "you are called to account." The words reverberated through him. Not just in his ears, but in his mind, his chest, his very soul, if he had won. Richard's instincts kicked in. He was a lawyer, after all. And if this was a courtroom, then he knew his role. Straightening his tie, he stepped forward. His voice, surprisingly steady, echoed across the vast chamber. "Account? For what? I've broken no law. If this is some kind of trial, I'll need to see the charges, the evidence, The benches stirred. A ripple ran through the faceless audience, a shift of shadows. And then Richard saw him, a man rising from the prosecutor's table. His face was familiar. Too familiar. Richard's stomach dropped. It was one of his former clients. A murderer. Richard remembered the case clearly. It had been a messy one. The evidence had been overwhelming, but Richard had torn it apart with ruthless precision. He had discredited witnesses, twisted the prosecution's timeline, and painted his client as the victim of police incompetence. Against all odds, he had won the acquittal. And here the man was now, standing tall, his eyes burning with something unearthly. "You freed me," the man said, his voice echoing with unnatural clarity. "Because of you, I walked away. And because of you, I killed again." The chamber shuddered, as if the very walls recoiled from the words. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but another figure rose. A politician this time. Sleek, smiling, smug. "You gave me back my power," the politician said. "And I used it to line my pockets, to crush my enemies, to ruin lives." One by one they stood. Clients Richard had defended. Criminals, liars, thieves, the corrupt. Each one stepping forward to recount what they had done after Richard had set them free. Richard's pulse quickened. He raised his hands, his voice sharp. "Objection. This isn't justice. I was doing my job. I worked within the law. I didn't commit their crimes. I defended them. That's what lawyers do." His words bounced off the marble walls. But the presence behind the judge's bench didn't respond. The faceless figures only stared. The murderer smirked. You knew I was guilty, and you still set me free. The politician sneered. You knew I would destroy more lives, and you still gave me back my power. Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in decades, he felt the slippery edge of losing control. The presence at the bench finally stirred. And what is the law, Richard? It asked, voice like thunder rolling through eternity. A shield for the guilty, or a light for the truth? You knew, and yet you chose. The chamber trembled. The faceless jury leaned forward as one. Richard opened his mouth, then shut it again. For once, he had no words. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to argue, to shout, to demand rules of procedure. But before he could speak, the murderer he had once defended stepped forward. His name came back to Richard, Thomas Kerrigan. A butcher by trade, but not of animals. A man who had painted his small town in blood before being caught. Richard had freed him. I told you, Kerrigan said, his voice cutting through the silence. I told you I would kill again, and you didn't care. Richard shook his head. I never asked. I never wanted to know the truth. That wasn't my job. Kerrigan's eyes flared. Not your job? Tell that to the women who screamed in the dark because you sent me back to the streets. Tell it to their families, who buried empty coffins because there was nothing left to bury. The chamber filled with a low hum, as though the faceless jury murmured in agreement. Richard opened his mouth, but the judge's presence loomed heavy, silencing him. Another figure approached. Senator Markham. Sharp suit, silver hair, the charming smile of a man who could sell lies as truth. You gave me my freedom, Markham said, voice smooth as oil. You knew the bribes I had taken, the schemes I had built, but you buried the evidence. You destroyed the testimony, and with my freedom, I built an empire of corruption. Richard raised his chin. The state's case was weak. Their evidence was flawed. I only exposed the holes. Markham chuckled. You didn't expose holes. You carved them. You twisted truth until it snapped. And because of you, I ruined thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. Families starved. Children lost homes. And you smiled and cashed your check. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. Then they came all at once. A thief he had defended, who admitted to robbing again the day after his release. A corporate CEO, who bankrupted entire towns while Richard toasted to his victory. A gang leader, whose release fueled a war in the streets, claiming lives Richard would never meet. Each one stepped forward, their stories laced with venom. You knew. You saw. You helped. Richard staggered back, clutching the edge of the defense table, as though it were an anchor. This isn't fair, he shouted. You can't hold me responsible for other people's choices. The faceless jury leaned closer. Their stillness was more terrifying than rage. Then came the voices that undid him. Not the criminals, the victims. The first was a mother. Her eyes were hollow, her voice trembling. My daughter was 17. She was walking home from school. He found her, and he should have been in prison. But you set him free. Because of you, I buried my child. Her grief crashed over Richard like a tidal wave. Another stepped forward, a man with a scar across his face. I begged for protection. I testified. I told the truth. And you tore me apart on the stand. You made me look like a liar. Because of you, my attacker walked free. Because of you, I live in fear. The chamber echoed with sobs, screams, whispers of broken lives. One after another, they rose from the benches, faces Richard had never seen, lives he had never considered, all tied to his victories. He staggered forward, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I didn't know what they would do. I only did my job. The mother's eyes bored into him. But you didn't care. Her words cut deeper than any blade. Aye. His throat closed. His hands trembled. For the first time in his career, Richard Hale was speechless. Then another figure stepped forward. Someone Richard hadn't expected. A fellow lawyer. Jameson. His old partner. You always said you fought for justice, Jameson said softly. But justice was never your goal. Victory was. You mocked me for defending the innocent. You said there was no money in it. You said truth was a fool's weapon. Richard's chest tightened. He remembered those conversations. He had laughed as Jameson struggled with pro bono cases, while Richard drove away in a new car each year. Jameson's eyes filled with sorrow. You had talent. More than anyone. You could have been a light. Instead, you chose to be a shadow. The chamber shook as the presence at the bench spoke again. You see, Richard, every choice is a ripple. Every word you spoke bent lives. And you told yourself it was only a job. But the truth is this, you served yourself. The words thundered inside him. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was inside his soul, unavoidable. No! Richard shouted, his voice raw. I didn't make them kill. I didn't make them steal. I didn't make them corrupt. They chose. They alone are guilty. Not me. His words echoed, hanging in the heavy silence. For a moment, Richard almost believed them himself. But then the mother's voice whispered, and you chose too. The whisper became a chorus, rising from every victim, every shadow. You chose. You chose. You chose. Richard dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the chamber thundered with the refrain. And then silence. Utter, suffocating silence. Richard knelt on the cold marble floor, trembling. His chest heaved with sobs he didn't know he was capable of. The faceless jury leaned back, still watching. The clients returned to their seats. The victims' voices faded into the void. Richard was alone, broken in the center of the courtroom. Then the judge's voice came, softer this time. Your defense is heard, but the trial is not over. Rise, Richard Hale. The truth is yet to be seen. The floor beneath him shifted. The marble rippled like water. And when Richard looked up, the courtroom was gone. Richard staggered as the marble floor dissolved beneath him. The darkness opened, but instead of falling, he found himself standing in a corridor that stretched beyond sight. It was impossibly vast, walls that glimmered like polished obsidian, stretching upward into a ceiling he couldn't see. Lining both sides of the corridor were doors. Hundreds. Thousands. Each different, wood, iron, glass, ornate, simple. Some tall as cathedral gates, others small enough to crawl through. Each one pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Richard's breath trembled. What is this place? The voice of the judge rolled through the hall, though no figure appeared. This is the Hall of Doors. Each door opens to a choice. Every decision you made, great or small, stands here. You will walk, Richard Hale, and you will see. The doors shivered as though stirred by the voice. Richard clenched his fists. I don't need to see. I know what I did. The silence answered him. And then, the first door creaked open. Richard stepped closer, drawn unwillingly. Inside, a scene played. A boy, maybe 12 years old, stood in a courtroom, nervously gripping the edge of the witness stand. Tears streaked his cheeks. Across the room, Richard stood younger, sharper, with his golden tongue flashing like a blade. You're lying, Richard's past self said coldly. You're confused. Children misremember all the time. Isn't it true your mother told you what to say? The boy shook his head desperately. No. I saw him, I saw. Richard's voice sliced through, relentless, merciless. By the end, the boy was reduced to sobs, his testimony shattered. The door swung wider. Richard saw the boy years later, older now, hollow-eyed, sitting in a dim apartment. A bottle in his hand. His life derailed. His sense of truth poisoned. The door slammed shut. Richard staggered back, clutching his chest. I was just doing my job. But the corridor offered no reply. Another door opened. Inside, a woman at a kitchen table, staring at an eviction notice. Her children slept in the next room, unaware of the storm outside their dreams. The woman's tears fell onto the paper. He promised us the settlement, she whispered. On the table, a newspaper headline blared. CEO cleared of charges. Attorney Richard Hale delivers stunning acquittal. The door showed Richard's smiling face at a press conference, shaking hands with the freed executive. Cameras flashed. Reporters praised his brilliance. Then the image shifted back to the family, packing boxes, children crying as their home emptied. Richard pressed a hand against the doorframe, his breath ragged. I didn't even know her name. The door closed with a heavy thud. A softer door opened, carved with cedar. Inside, Richard saw a college dorm. Himself at 19, laughing with his roommate Jameson, the same man who testified in the courtroom. They talked late into the night, full of ideals. Jameson spoke of justice, of serving truth, of defending those who could not afford defense. Richard, with a bottle in his hand, smirked. You'll die broke with your morals. Me? I'll win. That's what matters. The door showed the years that followed. Richard climbing, richer, more arrogant. Jameson struggling, worn, yet never breaking from his vow. The door closed, leaving Richard trembling. He was right all along. A smaller door creaked. Inside, Richard saw a homeless man on the street. He remembered this day vaguely. He had been rushing to court, briefcase in hand. The man reached out. Please, food. Richard had brushed past without slowing, muttering, get a job. The door lingered, showing the man's slow decline, sickness, despair, death in the cold. Richard slammed the door shut himself, his hand shaking violently. No, that can't be on me. But the hallway remained silent, as if it disagreed. He kept walking. Doors swung open on either side, unbidden. A teenager's ruined future after Richard humiliated him on the stand. A grieving mother watching him shake hands with the man who killed her son. A jury swayed not by truth, but by Richard's silver tongue, their verdict sending an innocent man to prison. Each door was a blow, each memory a crack in his armor. His steps grew heavier, his breath shallow. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with choices, lined with ghosts. Finally, he collapsed to his knees. Stop it! Please! I can't watch anymore. The corridor went still. Only the sound of his sobs echoed against the walls. Then, one door ahead glowed differently. Not dark, not heavy. Warm. Golden light seeped through its cracks. Richard crawled toward it, desperate for something, anything, other than the torment he had seen. The door opened. Inside, a memory he had long forgotten. He was young, fresh from law school, still full of something resembling hope. He took a pro bono case, defending a single mother falsely accused of theft. He fought with everything he had, and he won. The woman hugged her child in the courtroom, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. She grabbed Richard's hands. Thank you. You gave me my life back. For a moment, Richard felt warmth flood his chest. A glimpse of what he could have been. But the light dimmed. The scene shifted. The woman later, years down the road, asking Richard for help again. But by then, Richard had grown wealthy. He turned her away. I don't do free cases anymore. The door closed. The judge's voice rolled through the hall, deep and resonant. Every man is given chances, Richard. You were shown the path of mercy. You tasted the fruit of justice. And yet, you turned away, again and again, until you convinced yourself you were only doing your job. Richard's body shook. Tears streamed down his face. He pressed his forehead against the cold floor. Please, I can't bear this. Please, no more. The judge's voice softened, but carried a finality that pierced the marrow of his soul. There is one door left. At the far end of the corridor, a massive iron door loomed. Larger than all the others, towering, unyielding. It pulsed with a dreadful light, red and dark, as though it contained every sin he had buried. Richard's stomach twisted. He didn't want to move, didn't want to see, but the floor shifted beneath him, pulling him forward. Step by step, dragged toward the final door. The iron door groaned as it swung open. Inside, Richard saw not a memory, but something worse. He stood in a mirror of his own office. Luxurious, filled with awards, polished wood, shelves of law books. He sat at his desk, older, richer, smug. But behind him, invisible to his past self, shadows crawled, faces of the ruined, the lost, the dead. They pressed against the walls, whispering, clawing, but he never turned to see. And on the desk before him lay a single contract, written in fire, every victory, purchased with another's pain. Richard screamed and stumbled back, but the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the corridor like a verdict. The hall of doors shook violently, the walls trembling. The doors rattled, their whispers rising into a deafening roar. Richard fell to the ground, covering his ears. Stop! Stop! I see it now. I see what I've done. Please, no more. The corridor went dark. The doors vanished. The silence returned. And once again, Richard was alone. But this time, he was no longer defiant. He was broken. Darkness swallowed Richard after the hall of doors collapsed. For a moment, he thought he had fallen into the void. But when the ground steadied beneath him, he realized where he stood. The courtroom, the same vast chamber with walls of shadow. The faceless jury in their eternal silence. The high bench looming above. And there he was, back at the defense table. His body shook. His suit, once immaculate, now hung torn and stained with the dust of his trial. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. The judge's presence filled the air, heavier than before. "Richard Hale," the voice boomed. "You have seen the witnesses. You have walked the hall of doors. Now, the time has come for judgment." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to plead, to run. But he knew there was no escape. I was a lawyer," Richard stammered, his voice shaking. "That's all I was. I fought cases. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't do the things they did." The judge's silence pressed down like a mountain. Richard's voice grew frantic. "You can't hold me guilty for their crimes. I didn't swing the knife. I didn't steal the money. I didn't pull the trigger. I just did my job." His last defense. The same shield he had always carried. But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. For the first time, the faceless jury stirred. Their featureless heads turned in unison toward Richard. And from their silence rose a single whisper, a chorus of voices layered together. "You chose." Richard's blood ran cold. The same words from the hall of doors. The same refrain that had broken him. His knees buckled. He collapsed at the defense table, clutching at the wood as though it could save him. "No," he whispered. "Please. I didn't know. I didn't. The judge's voice thundered. "Richard Hale, you lived as if your life belonged only to you. You twisted truth into a weapon, wielded not for justice, but for victory. You told yourself you were only doing your job. Yet your job was chosen, and so were your methods. You knew the power of your tongue, and you used it to unmake lives." The chamber shook with every word. "And so, Richard Hale, you must answer for the legacy of your choices." Richard pressed his forehead to the table. His tears pooled on the polished wood. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tearing from his chest. "God, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see. Please forgive me." The silence after his plea stretched unbearably long. The air itself felt frozen. Richard waited for the sentence. Fire. Chains. Eternal darkness. He braced himself for hell. But the judge's voice came, softer than he had ever heard. "Richard Hale, do you repent?" The words struck him like a blade. His mouth opened, but no sound came. For once, he could not argue, could not twist, could not lie. All he could do was collapse fully onto the floor, weeping. Yes, I repent. I see what I was. I see it all now. I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong." The chamber trembled. The jury leaned back. The shadows themselves seemed to retreat. The judge's voice filled the air one final time. "Then your judgment is this. You will not be cast into the fire. Not yet. You will return." Richard froze. His sobs halted. He lifted his head slowly, disbelieving. "Return," he whispered. "Yes," the judge said. "You will live again. One chance. To use the gift you were given, not for victory, but for truth. Not for yourself, but for others. This is mercy. Do not squander it." The words echoed like thunder. Richard's heart pounded. I can go back. I can make it right." But the judge gave no answer. The chamber split open. The floor beneath Richard glowed with blinding light. He fell, not into darkness, but into radiance so pure it seared his vision. He screamed, but not in pain. In awe, in terror, in desperate hope. The faceless jury faded. The judge's presence dissolved into eternity. The last words thundered in his soul. One chance. Do not squander it. Richard's eyes flew open. He gasped for air. A ceiling came into focus above him, white, sterile. The sound of beeping machines. The sting of antiseptic. He was in a hospital bed. Tubes ran into his arm. His chest ached as though fire had burned through it. Nurses shouted, rushing to his side. "Doctor, he's awake. He's back." Richard blinked rapidly. His heart raced. He reached for his chest, feeling the weight of his body alive. The last thing he remembered, and then the trial. But had it been real? His trembling hand reached for the call button. His lips quivered. "One chance," he whispered. As doctors swarmed around him, checking his vitals, Richard stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything he had seen. The witnesses, the victims, the hall of doors. And for the first time in his life, he knew. This was not about victory. This was about redemption. Tears filled his eyes as he made a silent vow. If I've been given another chance, I won't waste it. The monitors beeped steadily. His chest rose and fell. Richard Hale had returned. But the question lingered. Would he truly change? Or would he squander the mercy he had been given? The answer would not be found in this courtroom of shadows. It would be found in life. Richard lay in the hospital bed, heart pounding against his ribs. Each breath felt both foreign and familiar, as if he were inhabiting his body for the first time. Doctors worked around him, their voices urgent. A nurse whispered, he shouldn't even be alive after that crash. Alive. The word thundered through his mind. He was alive. Returned. Given one chance. Richard's eyes closed. The echoes of the judge's words still rang in his skull. Do not squander it. 2 days later, a familiar face entered his room. Jameson, his old partner, the man who had stood as witness against him in the courtroom of shadows. Richard's breath caught. He half expected Jameson's face to blur into something otherworldly. But this was real. Flesh and blood. You're awake, Jameson said, setting a small bouquet on the bedside table. His voice was stiff, formal. They said you nearly died. Richard's lips trembled. He wanted to explain, to confess, to pour out everything he had seen. But how could he? Who would believe a man who claimed to have stood trial in the afterlife? So instead, he whispered, "Thank you for coming." Jameson studied him carefully, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He had known Richard as arrogant, smug, untouchable. But the man in the bed was pale, hollow-eyed, fragile. "Get some rest," Jameson said. But before he left, he paused at the door. Maybe this is a chance for you." The words struck Richard like lightning. Jameson didn't know how right he was. Weeks passed. Richard recovered. His firm welcomed him back with open arms. Clients lined up at his office door, desperate for his services. One morning, his secretary handed him a new case file. High-profile client. Big paycheck. They'll need you to dismantle the state's case. Richard opened the folder. A corporate executive accused of fraud. He had done this 100 times before. Expose the holes, twist the truth, break the witnesses. The strategy was already forming in his mind. But then, the memory of the Hall of Doors seared through him. The family at the kitchen table. The eviction notice. The hungry children. His hands shook as he closed the folder. "Tell them," Richard said softly, "I won't take the case." His secretary blinked. "Sir? I don't do that work anymore." For the first time, he turned away from profit. And the weight of it nearly crushed him. Change was not easy. The wealthy client stopped calling. His income shrank. His reputation shifted from the brilliant defense attorney to the man who went soft. Richard wrestled with temptation daily. Bills piled up. Former colleagues mocked him. Some nights, he stared at his reflection in the mirror and heard the whisper, "It would be so easy to go back." But then he remembered the judge's voice, the faceless jury, the mother's hollow eyes, and he chose differently. One afternoon, Richard passed the courthouse steps and saw a young man in tears. Public defender papers clutched in his hands, the ink still smudged. "What's wrong?" Richard asked. The young man looked up, startled. I can't afford a lawyer. They gave me one, but he's swamped with cases. No one will listen to me." "I didn't do it." Richard's chest tightened. Memories of the pro bono case from his youth flickered in his mind, the single mother he had once defended. "I'll take your case," Richard said. The young man blinked. "But I can't pay you. I don't want your money." The words felt strange on his tongue. Strange, but right. And for the first time in decades, Richard defended someone not for profit, but for truth. Months turned to years. Richard built a new practice, small but steady. He took cases no one else wanted. He defended the poor, the overlooked, the forgotten. Slowly, his name changed in whispers. Once, he was the devil's lawyer. Now, people called him the man who listens. It was not easy. He stumbled. He doubted. But every step away from his old life felt like peeling off chains he had never realized bound him. One evening, long after the courthouse lights had gone dark, Richard walked alone through the city streets. The world was quiet, the air cool. And then he felt it. A presence. Not as heavy as before, but unmistakable. The judge. Richard stopped beneath a street lamp, his breath visible in the night air. "Is it time?" he whispered. Silence stretched. Then the voice came, softer than a whisper, yet filling his soul. You are learning. Richard's chest ached. Tears filled his eyes. I'll never be able to undo what I did. No, the voice agreed. But you can choose differently now. Every choice is a ripple. You sowed pain. Now sow mercy. The presence faded. Richard stood beneath the street lamp, tears streaking his face, knowing he had been seen. Years later, Richard would sit in a modest office, papers stacked high, surrounded not by wealth or luxury, but by faces, clients he had helped, lives he had touched. He would remember the courtroom of shadows, the hall of doors, the verdict that spared him, and he would whisper, to no one in particular, "One chance. I didn't squander it." The camera pans back, leaving Richard at his desk, immersed in his quiet work. His redemption is not in grandeur, not in fame, but in the small victories of truth. And the audience is left with a single, haunting question. If you were given one chance, how would you live differently?